Last week we looked at some of the political conditions that were taking place at the time as far as different countries, and then looked at the political parties in Judah itself, that there were basically three political parties. The Egyptian party, that is, they wanted to go down to Egypt for help because of the fear of the rising Assyrian Empire. Then you had the opposing party, which would be the Assyrian party. Since they were the ones who were coming to power, they wanted to go to Assyria and make an alliance with them. And then the third party was the nationalistic party. That one would have been headed by Isaiah himself, and basically it was a party that said our faith needs to be in God and not in these foreign nations. Tonight, I want to deal with the unity of Isaiah. And in a sense, it's a real shame that we have to even deal with this subject. And you'll see why as we go through. But basically, some individuals have divided the book of Isaiah into either 2 or 3 separate books written supposedly by different men. The first one is called Deutero-Isaiah. Deutero-Isaiah is supposedly chapters 1 through 39 were written by Isaiah in the 8th century. Deutero, what does Deutero mean?
Deuteronomy?
No, it doesn't mean Deuteronomy. It means 2 or second. So the second part of Isaiah would be chapters 40 through chapter 66, written by who knows who in the 5th or 6th century. Then there's Trito-Isaiah, another group that says there's Trito-Isaiah. Trito would be what? 3. So 3 Isaiahs. Again, you have the first Isaiah written in chapters 1 through 39, same there, written by Isaiah again in the 8th century. Second Isaiah would be chapters 40 through chapter 55, supposedly written in the 6th century. Again, no one knows who wrote that part. The third part, third Isaiah, would be chapters 56 through chapter 66. And it was supposedly written in the 5th century. So those are, and then of course the other aspect would be that it is one book. But those are the 3 views, I guess you would say, in relationship to Isaiah. Let's look at some of the arguments for dividing it up. First argument is that there is a difference in theme and subject matter. In the first section, that's supposedly written by Isaiah himself, chapters 1 through 39, in that section, Assyria is the primary menace. That's the problem. They are the ones who are the powerful nation, and thus they become the problem in this first part of Isaiah. However, in the second part, Babylon becomes the primary opposition. They're the menace. If you use that term, I guess everybody here remembers Dennis the Menace. So they are the the menace in that second section from chapters 40 on. And so they say because there is a difference in the subject matter, the theme of those sections, it should be divided into at least 2, if not 3 parts, with different writers and different times. A second reason they state is a difference in language and style. Different words are used and different grammatical structure in the first part from the second part. And again, we're dealing with chapters 1 through 39 being the first part and chapter 40 on being the second part, whether you put it as 2 or 3, dividing it either way. The first section, chapters 1 through 39, is very bitter, denouncing, condemning type of language. The second section, on the other hand, is more comforting, more poetic. I started to say comforting again, but that's what I said a while ago. It's encouraging. So you have these 2 very strikingly different language and style of writing. And because of that, surely the same person could not have written both sections. A third reason, they say, is a difference in theology. What does the word theology mean? Study of God. Theos is God, and ology is the study of, so a study of God. Anytime you see that O-L-O-G-Y at the end of a word, you can almost always say it means a study of something or other, whatever the first part is. In this case, a study of God. So a difference in theology. The first section, chapters 1 through 39, would be very messianic in nature. There's a Messiah who's coming. The second section would be epitomized in chapter 53, for example, as the suffering servant. So you have a different aspect as far as this one that's going to come being presented, and so a difference in theology means that it should be separated into 2 different writers, at least 2. Another reason they say to divide it is that the name Isaiah does not appear in the last chapters, chapter 40 through 66. It does in the first part, but it doesn't in the second part. His name specifically does not appear. Do you get an idea that they are reaching for something and for some reason? Well, if you do, then you would be right. The real reason, all of these other things, there's some truth to it. But the real reason they want to divide it up is because they do not believe in predictive prophecy. That is the real reason. They try to divide the book up to make sure that there are no predictions in the book, and that it is just a book of history, nothing else. That's all. Why? Because they're modernist. Now, a modernist is someone who does not believe really in the inspiration of the Bible. They don't believe in any of the miracles of the Bible. They don't believe in Jesus' resurrection from the dead. They don't believe in his virgin birth. They don't believe in any predictive things fulfilling of prophecy. Gene?
He basically discounts the supernatural.
Yes, they basically discount the supernatural altogether. That these men wrote this, thus they made mistakes, and thus you will hear a lot of times individuals claim there's thousands of errors in the Bible. When I hear that, I ask them, name one. Well, what happens is that's what they've heard, and so they repeat it. They can't name one. But there's all these mistakes in the Bible. You can't really believe all of these things. Why? Because they don't believe in God as far as the God that would work in nature, that everything is simply man-oriented. Now then, one of the great problems thus comes over in the latter part of Isaiah chapter 44 and the first part of chapter 45. Because Isaiah gives Cyrus's name. Look at Isaiah 44 and verse 28. That saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Notice in chapter 45 and verse 1, then saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of king to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. Now, and if you have that chronology that I gave you, when did Cyrus come to pass and give these decrees?
537 or 8.
536 would be when he gave the decree. That's one I was really wanting. 536. Isaiah, when did he live? It's on there again. And Gene and Jerry don't have one of this, so he has to look at his notes. Okay, and that. So around give or take some, 150 years before Cyrus comes to be, Isaiah names him by name, says what he's going to do. That's predictive prophecy. Modernists don't believe that can happen. So what do they have to do? Well, we have to do something because obviously Cyrus's name is there. And it predicts, it states what he did. Put it that way for what they would be saying. So there has to be some answer to it. Well, you thus invent another Isaiah, a second or third Isaiah that writes after the fact of Cyrus, and thus can write this as history and then place it onto Isaiah as if it is a predictive prophecy, which they do not believe. And so when you divide it in chapter 40 or 39:40, that takes care of the problem, because this part was written as history by some second Isaiah. So when you're looking at these arguments, realize that the main reason for it is because these modernists do not believe in predictive prophecy and they have to explain it in some way. And so the way in which to explain it is there is a second or third person who wrote these words, and thus they wrote it as history, not as Isaiah writing it, happening before the time. Okay, those are the arguments for dividing the book. Let's look at some arguments for the unity of the book. In other words, they're just one book written by Isaiah. First, the New Testament attributes all of it to Isaiah. There are 308, and no, I didn't count all of them, in case you were wondering, 308 quotations from or references to Isaiah in the New Testament. Of these 308, 47 of the 66 chapters of Isaiah are alluded to or quoted from. The prophet Isaiah is called by name 21 times. All three of the sections, those so-called divisions, are all credited to Isaiah. So if you look at 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, 3rd Isaiah, in the New Testament, all of them attributed to Isaiah. Now, if we believe the inspiration of the Bible, that ought to be the end of the matter right there. But let me give a few illustrations, and I'll get a couple of people to read on this. Carl, turn over to Matthew 12, and you read verses 17 through 20. Paul, you turn to Isaiah 42, and you'll read verses 1 through 3. So Matthew 12, 17 through 20, Carl.
That it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall show judgment to the Gentiles. He shall not strive nor cry, neither shall any man hear his voice in the streets. The bruised reed shall he not break, and smoking flax shall he not quench, till he send forth judgment unto victory.
Okay, that's all. That's through verse 20. Right? He says, here's what was spoken by Isaiah the prophet. And then he quotes Isaiah. Paul, read Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 3.
Behold, my servant, whom I uphold, mine elect, in whom my soul delighteth. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. He shall not cry, nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed shall he not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench. He shall bring forth judgment unto truth.
Okay. Jesus, here in Matthew 12, says, here is a quotation from Isaiah the prophet. And who does he quote? He quotes Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 3. That's part of the second Isaiah that was supposedly not written by Isaiah. But Jesus says it's a quotation from Isaiah the prophet. I missed one. Dale, read Matthew 3:3, and Orville, if you would, turn to Isaiah 40 and verse 3. So Dale, Matthew 3 and verse 3.
Okay, there, Matthew 23. This is he
spoken of by the prophet Isaiah, saying, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight.
Okay. Again, here's what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah, and he quotes Isaiah. Or we'll read Isaiah 40 and verse 3.
The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight the desert a highway for our God.
Okay. Matthew 3:3 says this is a quotation from Isaiah the prophet, but he quotes Isaiah 40, which is in the second part. Again, should be someone other than Isaiah if there's this idea of a second Isaiah and a third Isaiah, because Isaiah didn't write that part, but Matthew says he did. Elward, if you'll read Acts the 8th chapter and verses 28 through verse 33. How much time? And Bill, if you'll turn over to Isaiah 53 verses 7 and verse 8. So, Elward, Acts 8 verses 28 through 33. No, through 33.
And he said, how can I except some man should guide me? And he desired come, that he would come up and sit with him. And the place of the scripture which he was read was, he was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and like a lamb dumb from his shearer, so opened he not his mouth. In his humiliation, his judgment was taken away, and who shall declare his generation, for his life is taken from the earth.
Okay. This is Philip and the eunuch. The eunuch's reading what? Isaiah the prophet. And it says the place in Isaiah the prophet that he's reading is this. Okay. Read Isaiah 53, 7 and 8, Bill.
He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before the shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment. And who will declare his generations? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken.
Okay, you have the same type of situation. He's reading Isaiah the prophet, then it says the part of Isaiah the prophet, but that is found in Isaiah 53, 7 and 8, which is the latter part, not the first part. Henry, turn over to Romans 10 and verse 16. And Bill, if you'll turn over to Isaiah 53 and verse 1. So Romans 10 and verse 16. Henry?
Okay, Romans 10 and verse 16. But they have not obeyed their gospel. And Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report.
Okay. Isaiah says this. What is it, Bill? Yeah.
Who hath believed our report? To whom is the arm of the Lord revealed?
Okay. Isaiah says, who hath believed our report? That statement is Isaiah 53 and verse 10. Again, it's attributed to Isaiah, not some imaginary writer. Gene, if you'll read Romans 10, verses 20 and 21, and then we'll get ready to turn over to Isaiah 65, verses 1 and 2.
But Isaiah is very bold and saith, I was found of them that sought me not. I was made manifest unto them that asked not after me. But to Israel he saith, all day long I have stretched forth my hands unto a disobedient and gainsaying people.
Okay. Isaiah is very bold and said this. Okay. Right? Isaiah 65, verses 1 and 2.
I sought of them that asked not for me. I am found of them that sought me not. I said, behold me, unto a nation that was not called by my name. I have spread out my hand all the day into the rebellious people, which walketh in a way that was not good after their own thought.
Okay. So the quote in Romans 10th chapter that is stated by Paul by inspiration, it was Isaiah the prophet, is found in Isaiah 65, verse 1 and 2, which would be, of those, if you divide it into the third section of Isaiah. But yet it's Isaiah the prophet who said it. Carl?
Why does the King James spell out with the E?
Trying to get me off on another tangent, I know. Very basically, it is a translation difference. It is, when you come to names, a lot of times you translate them, sometimes you transliterate them. Isaiah would be transliterated. That is, and I hope everyone knows the difference between transliteration and translation. Translation is bringing over the meaning of the word. Transliterating is taking the letters and bringing over the letters. Isaiah, as in the King James, it's transliterating. Now then, you also have a problem in the sense that you're dealing with three different languages: the Hebrew, the Greek, and the English in this case, because it is a Hebrew name, Isaiah, translated into the Greek as Isaiah, and then translated or transliterated, depending on if you use Isaiah or Isaiah. So that's why. And it's a decision of the translators as to how they handle that. Okay, so the New Testament attributes all of the book to Isaiah. A second thing is that various portions of the book indicate the same social and moral problems that are being addressed. For example, the Jews' hands were full of blood. And for quickness' sake, in Isaiah 1 and verse 15, and when you spread forth your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when ye make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. But you have the same type of statement as in Isaiah 59 and verse 3. For your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken lies. Your tongues hath muttered perverseness. So you have the same type of figures in both parts. You have the same idea as no justice in the land. Is another illustration. Isaiah 10, verse 1 and verse 2. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness, which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, that they may rob the fatherless. You have the same type of a thing in Isaiah 59, verses 4 through 7. None calleth for justice, nor any pleadeth for truth. They trust in vanity and speak lies. They conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity. They hatch cockatrices' eggs and weave the spider's web. He that eateth of their eggs dieth, and that which is crushed breaketh out into viper. Their webs shall not become garments, neither shall they cover themselves with their works. Their works are works of iniquity, and the act of violence is in their hands. Their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity. Wasting and destruction are in their paths. Have the same type of thoughts in both sections. So that's what I mean. The same social, moral problems in both sections. A third thing is that the fall of Babylon itself is predicted in Isaiah chapter 13. Now, if you remember, one of the arguments was the first section, chapters 1 through 39, dealt with the Assyrian problem. And chapters 40 on dealt with the Babylonian problem. But here you have the fall of Babylon being prophesied in Isaiah chapter 13. That's wrong section. Tradition. Now, I know we can't go totally by tradition, but tradition is old and strong for a single Isaiah. It was not until the late 1700s that the unity of Isaiah was challenged. That's when modernism really came into being. And people who that could give their names, but they wouldn't mean anything to you, so I won't. They, becoming modernist, basically German. It started in Germany at least. They became modernist, and so they started challenging the unity of Isaiah. Why did it take 1,700 years from the New Testament at least, and then going back another 600-700 years to finally discover that it's divided into more than one book? The Septuagint. Now, Septuagint translation was a translation that took place translating the Hebrew into the Greek around 270 BC. It was claimed that 70 men did it, and some even went so far as to say they did it in 70 days. And that's why it was given the name Septuagint, which means 70. But it has no indication that the book has multiple authors. Then 2 of the Dead Sea Scrolls treat Isaiah as a whole. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the spring of 1947. They had the complete text of Isaiah in Hebrew. So it becomes rather important as to discovery. It was discovered in a cave at the north end of the Dead Sea, thus the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was 7 miles south of Jericho. Probably written in the 1st century BC, and part of the reason they say that is it did not have vowel signs. Well, the vowels were added by the Masoretes centuries later. Hebrew was written originally without any vowels, just consonants. Try taking out all the consonants in our English language sometime in a few sentences and see what you come up with. Vowels were added centuries later. One section of Isaiah is not separated from another in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 1 is on the last line of space with the last verse of Isaiah chapter 39. How can you get any closer than that? I guess they weren't aware of the fact that these were written centuries apart. And also the sections that they want to divide it in, they were never circulated independently. Never had just chapters 1 through 39 and then 40 through 66. You add it all together. Well,
So it seems to me that these philosophers, they had too much time on it, and after the persecution, they were under religious persecution all those years, then after all of that was resolved, and they got religious freedom, and they could go and think on their own, it seems like they were after some, they just feel like a top.
it came as a result of German rationalism, which came after this period of time, and you had the Protestant Reformation taking place a little bit before that, and then you had primarily the German rationalism, which again, it's all, unless I can think about it and man can come up with it and do it, it didn't happen. And so rationalism, and thus rationalizing everything. Andrew, would you move it to the next one? Thank you. The leading of the book. When I say the leading of the book, that's Isaiah 1 and verse 1 primarily. Logically refers to all of the book. And you remember one of the arguments was that Isaiah's name does not appear in the latter section. It does in the first section, so that thus that's supposedly, well, there's no reason for it to appear in the latter sections or section. You have the first part of it when he says who he is and who he's, the time frame and all of that. No reason for him to repeat his name later on.
You don't normally do that when you're writing
No, not normally.
yourself, you don't mention your name on it.
That's the point. 25 times the phrase, the Holy One of Israel, speaks of God or Yahweh as the Holy One of Israel. 25 times Isaiah uses that. We mentioned this, I think, is last week or week before. It's only found 6 other times in the Old Testament altogether. In Isaiah, though, as I said, 25 times, it's found 12 times in chapters 1 through 39. That leaves how many?
13.
There you go, 13 times in chapters 40 through chapter 66. So, again, that speaks to the unity of the book, or the writer of the book.
I'm the only one that inhabits the eternity.
Oh, okay, where's that in the first part? Where's that in the first part? That's the second part. What about the first part?
They don't have that exact.
So it doesn't really apply, does it? That's why I'm saying it has to be in both parts. That's why Holy One of Israel, it's in both parts, and practically never in the rest of the Bible or the Old Testament. 25 times, though, in Isaiah 12 and 13. There's no reason to give in, to succumb to the anti-supernaturalistic views. That's the real reason they want to divide it. There's no reason to give in to that. Gleason Archer Jr. wrote, and this is in the Wycliffe Bible Commentary, there is not a shred of internal evidence to support the theory of a second Isaiah apart from a philosophical prejudice against the possibility of predictive prophecy. Now, I thought that was not a shred of evidence. Not any. The only reason he says is because of the possibility of predictive prophecy. And that's why I was emphasizing in relationship to the arguments for division, gets back to predictive prophecy. Gene?
When I've had discussions with people on stuff like this, they take some crazy idea and they're attacking the Bible, and they've stated their case. Well, see, so you got three Isaiahs. My response is, or not. It's just like they don't know what to do with that. They say
Yeah.
there's got to be three Isaiahs,
Or not.
Or not.
That's right.
How do you
That's true. They don't. Because what happens is that people hear these things, they never study them, but they've heard it, somebody who they think is a scholar, who will state that there has to be 2 or 3 Isaiahs. Why? They've never studied it. They don't know. They just heard somebody say it, and so they're repeating it. Kind of like that. There's thousands of mistakes in the Bible. Name one. It's kind of like, the headlights hit the deer. They don't know. It's just a phrase that they caught on to that somebody said, and they have no idea what it is. I did that a few times in the aspect or study of translation and translating the Bible and these translations that we have, and those that would argue, well, the NIV is so much easier to understand than the King James. And so I asked, name me a verse that's easier to understand. You know what? I never got a response to it. It was just simply something that they had heard through the years. The only thing that they could come up with, well, the King James uses these and thous. That really makes it more difficult to understand, doesn't it? Well, no, it's just they're repeating what they've heard. They've heard these people who attack the King James because they don't like it say that, well, these modern translations, you have to have new translations in order to hear it because they're easier to understand. Okay, what? Tell me a verse.
Use the argument, well, if you don't agree with that, you don't agree with Dr. So-and-so.
Yeah, that's another favorite. I'll add, I could actually give a few verses that would be easier to understand than some of the modern translations. They couldn't, but I could have. Because some words have changed meanings through the years. And they don't mean the way, they don't mean in the verse the way in which we use the word today, and so they become confusing for us if we don't know the language. That's a good one. These shall not prevent them which are asleep. What does it mean? How do we use the word? To stop something? What does it mean, though, in the Bible? Precede. Go before. Yeah. Now then, if they had brought that verse up, for example, I would say, well, you're right, that is an illustration, but you're using and then I would have gone back to the argument, really, that is of more value. And Andrew, if you'll go ahead and change that to the